Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, December 21st. I'm Aryeh O'Sullivan, and this is IBA News broadcasting from Jerusalem. We open with developments taking place right now outside the Mistayahu prison, where convicted rapist and former president Moshe Katsav is getting ready to go home after serving 5 years in prison. The decision to release Katsav was now made just a few minutes ago after the state decided not to appeal the prison's parole board decision to grant Katsav an early release after serving over 2/3 of his 7-year jail term. The parole board acknowledged that it had observed seeds of repentance in Katsav, who has maintained his innocence throughout his incarceration. Members of the board said that they have no doubt that Katsav, who's been convicted of 2 counts of rape and a series of other sexual offenses, has undergone a dramatic change during his term in prison. The 72-year-old Katsav will have to abide by a number of regulations. Among them, he will not be permitted to leave the country. He will have to be home at 10 o'clock and remain at home until 6 o'clock in the morning, and will not be able to give any media interviews. Local, regional, and municipal authorities today launched an open-ended strike in protest of the planned cuts to their budgets. The work action affected a wide range of public services across the country. No studies were conducted at high schools or municipal kindergartens, forcing hundreds of thousands of students, children, and their parents to stay home. Elementary schools in most areas were open, but without administration or sanitation services. Other services such as garbage collection, social and welfare services, and parking supervision came to a complete halt. The strike was called early this morning after negotiations between the Finance Ministry and the umbrella organization representing the local authorities failed to reach an agreement. The municipalities have come out strongly against the announced across-the-board cuts to the state budget, which they claim will directly take hundreds of millions of shekels from the local authorities and undermine the already weak sectors of society. Municipality heads convened again throughout the day and are slated to issue an announcement later tonight as to what their next steps will be. They accused Treasury representatives of showing no flexibility in the overnight talks. For its part, the Prime Minister's office said that while every effort was being made to avert the strike, both the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister are not willing to change the budget. The Jerusalem municipality was the only one not affected by the move, since its services fall under a different budget. Following the state's request to delay the slated evacuation of Amona by 45 days, the High Court of Justice has ordered both sides, residents of Amona and the Palestinian petitioners, to submit their response by no later than 5:30 this afternoon. Meanwhile, at Amona, residents are anxiously waiting to see if the agreement holds or whether they'll be forced to face off against an evacuation. I visited Amona yesterday and filed this report. It's a cliche to call this a windswept mountaintop, but it is. And for the 42 families living here for the past 2 decades, they're certainly feeling left out in the cold.
We're feeling like there's a very big injustice here done to us.
Do you feel uncertain about the future now?
We feel very much uncertain, even more than we felt before.
Elad Ziv built his home with his own hands and is bitter about their predicament. He lashes out at the anti-Zionist organizations like Yesh Din, the courts, and left-wing media for portraying them in a negative light as they face eviction.
The government has to prove to the people, to the voters, to us, that it's going to do its share of the agreement that we've reached. The Supreme Court is above any law in Israel, and it can ruin the whole thing.
Elad, like other residents here, looks out and sees the neighboring Arab villages, but he says he has no desire to form relations with them.
The Palestinians, the Arabs, they didn't even know about that this existed. There was nothing here. No tree, no cultivation, nothing was here before we came.
So you've been
We did not push anybody out.
In Silwad, village head Mohammed Jalal says they are scrambling to find documentation that local Arabs own the plots the government has set aside for the Amona residents, but haven't found them yet. According to media reports, each family in Amona will receive 1 million shekels for agreeing to move. In the arrangement that you were shown, were there figures of any money given?
No, we weren't shown any figures.
Because the press was told you're going to get over
Well, the press
all this money.
wants to, it's always trying to demonize us, to make us look very bad and like it's all the time they attack us from a different direction. This is what they want to do. This is how they want the public to view us. But the public views us, he knows that we are not here for the money.
There is concern over possible clashes with Amona settlers and militant supporters if it comes down to a forcible evacuation. This is a temporary structure that was built to house the youth who were protesting against the evacuation of Amona. On the walls, it's written, "Soldier, policeman, how do you turn against your brother?" It's also written, "Over Judea and Samaria, there will be a war." Now the structure is empty, and if the deal falls through, it could be filled again with protesters against the evacuation of Amona.
So we told the government, if you're going to implement this agreement, we agreed to this agreement. But if there are going to be changes, or you're not going to implement, then we're going to be against it.
So it's not over yet.
Nothing is over. Now, because we're in agreement, we're not going to fight. We're going to do our part of the agreement. But if the government withdraws from this agreement, we will have to fight.
As far as the residents here are concerned, the country is behind them. Do you think that the country's behind you?
Yeah, I'm sure the country.
How do you know that?
Because the country has put the right-wing government to implement a right-wing agenda. This whole place is going to be demolished for nothing, for these 2.5 dunams that were never proved, no one proved ownership of them. And we're going to be moving to another place in this here on Amona.
Okay. You can live with that?
If all the agreement will be followed and they will be implemented, then we can live with that. It's the same unjust. It's unfair. It's unjust. This whole thing shouldn't have come to the world. But we know that we are not afraid of the long run.
The Knesset House Committee is at this hour convening to discuss the possibility of stripping Israeli Arab lawmaker Bassel Ghatas of his MK immunity, as recommended by Attorney General Avichai Mandelblit. Ghatas, a member of the Balad party of the Joint Arab List, confessed to smuggling cell phones to Palestinian security prisoners incarcerated in Israeli jails. Ghatas himself is not attending the Knesset debate, charging that the session is purely political and its results are easily predicted and known in advance. He is also accusing the police and law enforcement authorities of completely overriding his basic rights by leaking what he called biased details of his investigation and the allegations leveled against him. On Tuesday, Ghatas was questioned for over 3 hours at the police 433 Lahav fraud unit on suspicion of conspiring to commit a crime, fraud, breach of trust, as well as smuggling prohibited items into a prison. Jewish worshippers praying at the tomb of Breslev founder Rabbi Nachman in the Ukrainian town of Uman this morning were horrified and shocked after gangs of vandals entered the tomb before dawn, and they threw a pig's head bearing a carved swastika inside the compound, splashed red paint on the floors and the walls, and sprayed tear gas as they shouted anti-Semitic slogans at the worshippers before fleeing. Video footage from the ordeal shows the paint-covered prayer room and the pig's head that was removed by worshippers and placed outside. Expressing outrage, Yesh Atid party leader MK Yair Lapid said he contacted the Ukrainian ambassador in Israel, urging him to ensure the perpetrators are brought to justice and boost security at the sites frequented by Jewish worshippers. Attempts continue to locate the Israeli woman who went missing in Monday's fatal terror attack at the Christmas market in Berlin. The Islamic State terror group has claimed responsibility for the attack, which left 12 people dead and 48 injured. IBA's Margaret Dudkevich has the latest.
The children of Rami and Dalia Eliakim, the Israeli couple who were visiting the market at the time of the attack, are assisting authorities in Berlin in tracking down their mother, Dalia, who is still missing. Israeli consulate officials accompanying the family said they've not ruled out the possibility she's still alive, but has not yet been located at one of the many hospitals. Some relatives expressed frustration over the failure of the German authorities to identify the victims 48 hours after the attack. Rami, who was seriously injured, remains heavily sedated after undergoing surgery. The Islamic State claimed responsibility, saying one of its soldiers ploughed the truck into the crowded market in response to appeals to target citizens of coalition countries attacking ISIS in Iraq and Syria. The statement failed to identify the terrorist, who still remains at large. German investigators are analysing DNA traces and fingerprints, as well as GPS data that may assist them in tracking down the perpetrator of the attack. Police say they're looking for a Tunisian man after finding an identity document under the driver's seat of the truck. 2 suspects were released from custody after it was determined they were not involved. One was set free this morning, and a Pakistani suspect police arrested the night of the attack was released last night. police have not ruled out the possibility that more than one terrorist was involved, saying a manhunt for the attacker they described as armed and dangerous continues. They also revealed the Polish truck driver whose body was discovered inside the vehicle had been stabbed and shot in an apparent struggle with the assailant to prevent the attack. At the market site, which remains sealed off to the public, forensic specialists and investigators continued searching for clues that may assist them in the ongoing investigation. With Christmas just days away, the level of alert has been raised in Germany and across the European continent, with police bolstering their presence in Christmas markets throughout Europe. While trying to maintain the holiday spirit, many fear it's only a matter of time before the Islamic State strikes again. Margo Dudkiewicz, IBA News.
Europe is experiencing an unrelenting wave of terror, primarily caused out by individuals affiliated with the Islamic State terror group. Well, joining us now from our Tel Aviv studio to discuss the issue is Dr. Amira Halperin, an associate researcher at the Hebrew University's Truman Institute and an expert on international terror. Dr. Halperin, welcome.
Thank you.
Dr. Halperin, here we are in the midst of the Christmas holiday season abroad, and how concerned should Europeans be at this point?
The occasion, the Christmas holiday, was deliberately, of course, was chosen by ISIS because they wanted to create fear and chaos in Europe. So it's a very big issue, a very big concern in Europe among the citizens, because as we know, the Christmas markets are still open, thousands of them in Europe, and the fear is still there.
Well, ISIS claimed responsibility, and the attack in Berlin is similar to the one that was carried out in Nice earlier this year. How easy is it for terrorists to wage these attacks on soft targets, ramming trucks into crowded places?
Especially in Christmas markets, as we know, there are open places with no much security, no bag checks. It's very easy to go in and to carry out the attacks. The question might be is how the terrorists have managed to go inside the area or have managed to facilitate the whole thing. This is another question, but in terms of being in this area and actually carrying out the attack, it's not very difficult to do.
Do you think that Europe is ready to adopt the Israeli approach to security?
I cannot hear it.
Do you think that Europe is prepared to adopt the Israeli approach to security?
Yes, sure. This is again the point that in Israel and in Europe is being discussed for many years now, that the European governments really understand that they have to adopt the Israeli approach in terms of profiling and security checks. And of course, the major issue in Europe now is the immigration crisis, that there will need to be check-up relating to immigrants and relating to fake immigrants entering to Europe, and reconsideration of the immigration policy.
Well, what's the most effective way to deal with Islamic terror? Should the European countries share information? Have they started working closer with the Israelis?
I believe it is the case. It's not just now. There is a cooperation for many years between the Israelis and the European governments. The challenge is that the European governments have to adopt the Israeli policies maybe, or the Israeli system, or the Israeli ways to tackle terrorism, but the system in Europe is very different. The policy is very different. And as we know, there is a policy of the problem does not exist in Israel, for example, the problem of asylum seekers and the wave of immigrants from Syria, etc. So it's a very big problem to tackle.
Well, how big really is the ISIS threat to Europe?
It's very big, because the people that relate to, as you mentioned earlier, it's a global organization. There are links between Nice and Germany and even the US, as Trump talked about recently in his pre-election campaign. There is a problem of immigrants cooperation. The cooperation is a global cooperation in the US and in the European governments. And ISIS people, individuals, are not merely people that have been recruited in Middle Eastern countries. Some of them are European, were born in Europe, have been radicalized and ready to carry out attacks. So this is the reason why it's a very huge problem for the governments to deal with in Europe and in the US, I have to say.
Well, finally, Dr. Halpern, I want to ask you one question about Monday's on-camera shooting of the Russian ambassador in Turkey. How did this take place? How did the assailant manage to pass through all the security checks?
Again, as far as I understand from my experience, it is very difficult indeed to sort out the problem of security, because security is not just a security that takes place at the moment of the event itself. Security is a whole approach, a whole process that have to be taken out beforehand, and maybe it's very difficult for the European and for governments and for politicians to adopt the approach of taking a much more radicalized steps towards radicalization, and rather in not, I don't know, maybe the approach of liberal and values, etc., doesn't work anymore.
Well, Dr. Mira Halpern of the Truman Institute, thanks so much for joining IBA News.
Thank you very much.
Prime Minister Netanyahu says Israel is exploring ways to expand its medical assistance to injured Syrian civilians. Addressing the foreign press at the government press office's annual New Year's reception in Jerusalem yesterday, Netanyahu expressed doubts over whether the crisis in Syria can be resolved. However, he said that the Jewish state can help mitigate some of the suffering. Until now, most of the injured Syrians treated in Israel were from regions close to the Golan Heights. Transferring wounded from Aleppo is a far more complicated issue.
I've asked the Foreign Ministry to seek ways to expand our medical assistance to the civilian casualties of the Syrian tragedy. Specifically in Aleppo, we're prepared to take in wounded women and children, and also men if they're non-combatants. We'd like to do that. Bring them to Israel, take care of them in our hospitals, as we've done with thousands of Syrian civilians.
Meanwhile, foreign and defense ministers of Russia, Iran, and Turkey have convened in Moscow in an effort to broker a peace deal aimed at resolving the conflict in the war-torn country of Syria. The United States, whose efforts to achieve a ceasefire have so far failed, was excluded from the meeting. The United Nations was also not informed. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov later informed U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry of the decisions reached, expressing confidence that principles for an agreement drafted in the meeting will achieve their goal. At a press briefing yesterday, a spokesman for the U.S. State Department said Kerry did not feel snubbed for being left out of the meeting, adding that U.S. Secretary of State welcomes all efforts that will achieve a lasting peace in Syria. The controversial idea of moving the American embassy in Israel to Jerusalem has once again been raised, but this time by Israel's ambassador to the United States, Ron Dermer, who has called on U.S. President-elect Donald Trump to move the embassy from Tel Aviv. Speaking at his annual Hanukkah reception, Dermer said such a move would be a great step for peace and would immensely help Israel tackle ongoing efforts to delegitimize the Jewish state. Dermer's remarks come several days after Trump's appointment of David Friedman as the next U.S. ambassador to Israel, who said right off the bat that one of his tasks will be to move the embassy to Jerusalem. Defense Minister Avigdor Lieberman says that after studying the ramifications, he opposes shortening mandatory service for soldiers. Lieberman told reporters he hopes the subject will be reopened for discussion at the beginning of next year. Earlier this month, the Knesset's Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee approved the second and third readings of a bill calling to cut mandatory service to 30 months starting in 2020. In addition, the military establishment is considering signing up soldiers who serve in special units for a period of 4 years. Minister of Energy and Water Yuval Steinitz has invited European Union Climate Action and Energy Minister Miguel Arias Canate to participate in a summit in Israel early next month to finalize the laying of a gas pipeline to Europe. Steinitz decided to hold the summit after Canate revealed intentions to assist in funding such a pipeline from gas fields offshore Israel and Cyprus to the European continent. The energy ministers of Cyprus and Italy have also been invited to participate in the meeting, as the pipeline will run through their countries. The estimated cost of the project is more than $6 billion. The EU has been looking for ways to reduce its dependence on Russian gas. Earlier this month, the government officials from Israel, Greece, and Cyprus agreed to advance their proposal for exporting gas to Europe from the eastern Mediterranean. Passengers on El Al flight LY-30 from Toronto to Tel Aviv had quite a scare last night. The plane was forced to make an emergency landing at Toronto's Pearson's Airport after one of its engines caught fire and began leaking less than an hour after takeoff. No one was injured in the incident, and the passengers were taken to a nearby hotel where they spent the night. The company launched an investigation and rescheduled its passengers on a different flight today.
Mayday, mayday, mayday. That's 030. We have a right engine failure.
The upcoming Hanukkah holiday may be celebrating the victories of the Maccabees over the Greeks, but a reminder of the ancient king Antiochus IV was uncovered in recent days inside Jerusalem's Tower of David. The rare coin, minted around 170 BCE, bears the portrait of the vilified king on one side and a goddess wrapped in a scarf on the other. Archaeologist Lorna Cohen said she spotted the bronze coin by chance near a Hashmonean-era wall that runs through the citadel's courtyard. King Antiochus made the harsh decrees that led to the Maccabean revolt. And if you're looking for something to do with the kids over Hanukkah holiday, the Bloomfield Science Museum is opening its doors free of charge to children up to the age of 18. In a different light is the Hanukkah happening and features activities, exhibits, displays, and workshops for the entire family. The Make Light exhibit is an annual theme display. This year, Light Outside the Box uses fun and games to shed light on something as simple as casting a shadow. In finance, shares on the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange were down across the board today, while the shekel gained in strength against major foreign currencies. Here's the late afternoon numbers. The IBA weather team said it will remain partly cloudy tomorrow with local rain expected in the north and coastal regions. And thunder showers can also be expected. Here are the estimated highs and lows at home and abroad for the next 24 hours. That's our broadcast for today. Please join us again tomorrow for the latest news from Israel. I'm Ariel O'Sullivan, wishing you a good evening and shalom from Jerusalem.